Set in Jefferson, Mississippi, A Rose for Emily was William Faulkner's first short story to be nationally published. Following the sequence of events throughout this story might feel difficult to some of you, just because it's told in a non-linear fashion. It is also stated in the story about the old generation of Jefferson, to whom all the past is not a diminishing road, but, instead, a huge meadow which no winter ever quite touches, divided from them now by the narrow bottleneck of the most recent decade of years. This quote and how the story is told shows Faulkner's modernist ways of viewing time. Also, despite the main character being Emily Grierson, hence the title, it isn't actually told from Miss Emily's perspective. Instead, the narrator is a gender-neutral we, suggesting that the narrator, whose true identity remains hidden, belongs to a group of townspeople who observe Emily from a distance and gossip amongst themselves. One interesting thing about this we is that the narrator distances themselves from the rest of the townspeople in the scene where people break into Emily's room after her funeral. The narrator, who always says we, chooses the word they, as if wanting no part in the act. Anyways, due to this narrator, readers are not provided any in-depth personal insight to Emily's psyche, nor accurate details of what really happened. Rather, readers are allowed room to speculate about the tragic life of the Southern Gothic heroine through the hints that are thrown their way and put the pieces into place. There are two notable topics in Faulkner's 1930 short story that shows how the setting, which is the South and decades after the Civil War, is key to the story: race and class. To begin with, there aren't many events within the story that directly involves race. However, some quotes or characters indicate the racial setting of the American South during the post-Civil War period. For example, the scene where Colonel Sartoris, then mayor of Jefferson, is said to have fathered the edict that no Negro woman should appear on the streets without an apron in 1894 is a clear show of racism at that time. Despite it having been 30 years after the Civil War had ended, thus a couple of decades past the Reconstruction era as well, the treatment of African Americans hadn't improved in the South. Another element that points out the racism in the South is Tobe, Miss Emily's servant. Tobe is the only person other than Emily in the Grierson house who knows the truth. However, his identity within the story is decreased to the Negro, or the Negro man. He is not viewed upon or talked about as an individual who exists outside his race or his relationship with Emily, the monumental lady of Jefferson, due to the remaining white superiority of the South. At Emily's funeral, men of the old generation are shown to have worn their Confederate uniforms. These uniforms symbolize the deeply rooted, unwavering ideas of the Confederacy, including slavery and racism in the South as well. This leads to the topic of class in A Rose for Emily. The story's time period is set to when the South was becoming more modernized, which meant that the influence and power of white aristocracy was declining. Conflicts between the old and new generations arose too, due to the devaluation of tradition, which includes class. One of them was about Emily's exemption from taxes. Colonel Sartoris had exempted her from paying taxes by making up an excuse about owing her late father. This was because he had honored her position as the town's elite upper class. However, once the new generation became the town authority, they demanded that Emily pay her taxes like everybody else, to which she replied, "I have no taxes in Jefferson." Similarly, when strong odor from Emily's house was bothering the townspeople, they had asked Judge Stevens to handle it. To this he had said, "Will you accuse a lady to her face of smelling bad?" Another conflict arose when the town was introduced to free postal delivery. Emily alone had refused the installation of mailbox to her door. Also, prejudice against Northerners and people of the lower class in the South is shown in the story through a lady saying, "Of course a Grierson would not think seriously of a Northerner, a day laborer," about Homer Barron, a foreman who had been seen courting Emily. Through this video, we briefly went over two key points: race and class of the South, to look out for when reading Faulkner's A Rose for Emily. The story moves back and forth through time, showing readers Emily's funeral, Emily as a young girl who was terrorized by her strict father, a woman who was in love, and a secretive old woman who had stubbornly refused to be modernized. It deals with concepts such as psychological trauma and the mystery of murder as well. Perhaps William Faulkner had her tragic life in mind when he wrote the title, the rose being a symbol of his respectful salute to the fallen monument of Jefferson.